me.
Thank you.
Well, Stephen Jones, we heard that interview there. Why won't Labor push ahead and bring this to a vote? If we know Labor and the Greens have the numbers in the Senate to defeat the carbon tax repeal bills, why not just have the vote?
Because we don't think we should be gagging debate on an important public policy issue. And can I say, in respect to Greg Hunt's comments, I mean, he's a bit of a joke on this. It's really a bit rich taking a lecture from the party that used the Senate to block supply and bring down a government. It's a bit rich getting a lecture from them.
We're going back to 1975 here, Stephen. We're going a long way back.
Well, mate, it was your party who did it.
We're going a long way back.
It's a bit rich taking a lecture on them on the role of the Senate
Stephen,
in thoroughly scrutinising legislation. Greg Hunt is entirely within his rights to put a bill before the House of Reps to introduce the policy that they stood on in the 2013 election. We are entirely within our rights to stand on our platform. He's entirely...
But is Labor deliberately stalling on this one, though?
Absolutely
We've seen this
not.
debate going on and on for a long time now. We know everyone's positions. Why not just bring it to a head?
Completely artificial timeline that Greg Hunt has created.
And what was your platform at the election, Stephen?
His own party. And
what was your platform at the election?
Our platform, as you know full well,
terminate
you used
the
to agree
carbon
with
tax.
a price on carbon,
This is
Alan.
Hang on.
Well, you'll be able
let
to
you go
say
one at a time.
we agree with terminating the carbon tax as long as it's replaced with an emissions trading scheme. That's the policy that we took to the election. That's the policy that we argued in the House of Representatives. It's the policy we're arguing in the Senate. You're entitled to argue yours. You're not entitled to ask us to abandon ours.
Alan, why is it so important that you want to have this vote before Christmas when it wouldn't take effect anyway until the middle of next year?
This was the central theme of the election. We took it to the election that we would scrap the carbon tax, and we want to do it as quickly as possible so that it can be brought into effect as quickly as possible. What the abolition of the carbon tax will mean on average $550 less per household, $220 lower electricity bills per household on average. These are based on your own figures, Stephen.
But these are, as you said, averages, so it could vary wildly.
It'll vary from family to family depending on your electricity use and depending on the size of the household. But on average, a family will be $550 better off. Businesses will be better off. Because their electricity consumption will be lower, and particularly manufacturing businesses who so heavily rely on electricity and energy.
But the point I was making, though, why the push, the imperative to have this done in the next 2 days when we know the way the numbers stack up anyway?
The question, Julie, is why isn't the Labor Party backing it? Because they went to the 2010 election promising not to introduce a carbon tax, and then they introduced one. They went to the 2013 election promising to, quote, terminate the carbon tax. And now they're actually breaking their promise in not allowing us to get rid of it. We want the Labor Party to terminate the carbon tax just as they promised they would do. We also promised to terminate the carbon tax, and we will do it.
But Labor promised to remove the carbon tax, replace it with an emissions trading scheme.
That's right.
They were very clear. They made it clear from Prime Minister Rudd at the time that we will terminate the carbon tax, he said. No ifs, no buts. Let's deliver that. If they want to try to introduce an emissions trading scheme,
very fond
they should
of
do
picking
so
up
subsequently.
half of the policy where it suits you and ignoring the rest. Let me tell you why we believe on putting a price on carbon, because it's worked. 7% reduction in carbon emissions. At the same time, over 150,000 jobs have been created. The economy grew by about 2.5%, and Whyalla still exists. So we know it's working. We think we can move to a more efficient scheme, one that Alan used to believe in when he wasn't bound by his ridiculous party policy. Putting a price on carbon, a market-based mechanism, we think it'll work. Greg Hunt has created this ridiculous pantomime, which he's very fond of, an artificial deadline. He knows it's not going to meet. He can't bully the Senate. The Senate are the masters of their own destiny. I think quite rightly they have said, well, we need to flesh all of this out.
All right, well, let's move on to our final issue for today. And a $300 million fund to give pay rises to childcare workers has been axed by the Abbott government. Former Prime Minister Julia Gillard announced the Early Years Quality Fund to give childhood educators and teachers in long daycare centres a pay rise for 2 years. But the Coalition has announced it will redirect the funding to professional development programs for staff instead. The Assistant Minister for Education, Susan Lee, says she's invited childcare providers to return the money they've already been allocated.
Our plan is to professionally develop the entire childcare sector and to use the funds that Labor had allocated to its slush fund in order to do exactly that. And it's really important that we recognise that $30 million of our professional development fund will be allocated to vulnerable and disadvantaged children.
This is just insane. This is bizarre. This is such a shambles, such a chaos, that somebody needs to step in and set the Assistant Minister right. This is yet another example of policy on the run, of backflips, of broken promises from this out-of-control government.
Stephen Jones, to you firstly on this one. The report into this fund found evidence, I'll quote from it, that the requirement to have an enterprise agreement was used by United Voice to increase its union membership. Is this an appropriate way to use a fund of this kind?
Can we just go back to the purpose of the fund? There's some ridiculous stuff has been said in that report. Why was the fund set up? Because childcare workers are some of the lowest paid in the country with some of the most important responsibilities. That's why we have such high turnover.
The report into this fund, though, has made this observation that the requirement to have an enterprise agreement...
Absolutely. Nothing extraordinary about that. If you want to have above award wages, those companies that put in place an enterprise agreement to ensure that you get above award wages, that's exactly what is going on here.
So you reject any accusation that it was used to bolster union membership?
Absolutely. It's absolute nonsense. It's a huge smokescreen to cover the fact that Susan Lee has done a backflip. She's reneged on a commitment they gave before the election. We believe that childcare workers in this country deserve professional wages, and we're in there trying to help them. Now Susan Lee's trying to rip that money away from them.
Alan, to you briefly on this one, because we're soon running out of time, but the money will be redirected towards professional development. What does that actually mean? And would it have been better to have been a wage increase for somebody, extra money in their pocket?
Well, the federal government's never been in the business of providing money for private entities for wage increases. The Fair Work Commission is there for that. Let's be very clear. This $300 million fund was there to grow union membership. Pure and simple. We said that at the time. The Australian Childcare Alliance, which represents 60% of all childcare providers, said that at the time. And now this report from PricewaterhouseCoopers also confirms
So what professional development programs, though, what will that be?
Well, it allows individual childcare centres to apply for a fund in order to use that money to go on to boost the skills of their workers. So it might be particular courses that they can go on. It might having people who provide training inside the centre.
Can I explain to you why this is complete
Very
hypocrisy?
quickly.
Because they opposed professional standards for childcare workers when that bill was before the House. This is just a backdoor way to rip the money out of the sector. They already have professional qualification. What they need is professional wages.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Stephen Jones, Alan Tudge, thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Stephen.
And that's Capitol Hill for now. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow.